Speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open the second day of this conference with a session on Towards a True European Common Migration and Asylum Policy, which will be introduced by Luigi Manconi, Chairman of the Senate Special Committee on the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. And then we will have four keynote speakers: Minister of the Interior Angelino Alfano, speaking also as President of the Internal Affairs Council, Robert Visser, Executive Director of the European Asylum Support Office, Elizabeth Collett, Director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe, and François Crépeau, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, who has sent us a video message. And then we'll open the debate. As we did yesterday, speaking time for each speaker will depend on the number of requests for the floor we receive, so that we can leave sufficient time of response to the speakers after the comments from the floor. Please use the forms we are distributing if you want to speak. We have had a very interesting debate yesterday. The list of rights and the forms in which they are safeguarded is becoming vaster and vaster. Every day, the European Union and national legislations are changing, and every day we see the national constitutional courts and the Court of Justice of the European Union dealing with human rights cases. There are also new institutional bodies dealing with specific human rights issues, but in some cases there are cases of duplication. And I think that in our reflection, we are still missing an ability to think freely about the institutional system of rights safeguard as complex as the one we have, with specific definitions of powers and duties and rights of each of these bodies. I'm not talking only about the Union itself and the member states themselves, but also about the very many bodies that have specific competencies in this field. I think I can also say, and it should be one of the points to be freely reflected upon, I think what's missing also is an element of full transparency and recognition on the part of the citizens of the action taken by individual actors. I think the main point of complementarity should be analyzed from the point of view of rationalizing competencies and powers, and therefore responsibilities of each of these, which would mean better use of resources, an overall monitoring system to monitor the results and the effectiveness of policies that are undertaken and implemented. Of course, this is nothing new. But I think we should think of an objective figure we have, and that is that the results, our results in the field of safeguarding and protecting human rights, is well below our ambitions as Europeans. And sometimes, as in the case of migrants, they represent a true emergency. Madame Reichters yesterday told us that outside the rule of law, you don't have protection of fundamental rights. I would like to add to that, that without effective institutions in this field, in particular in this field. Those same institutions are doomed to decline. And we all know what a danger there is for Europe. And they are doomed, and also the rights we're supposed to protect and defend are doomed to decline. I also believe that our reflection these days should also ask a question. I'm talking about migration asylum here. I think we should have a more ambitious objective. Many colleagues yesterday stressed the fact that there is a need for greater effort to integrate the member states' policies. But my question is this: a common European foreign policy, would it make our policies in the field of migration and asylum stronger? And now I leave the floor to President Manconi, who will speak for 5 minutes, and then I will give the floor to the other speakers. I would like to remind you that we have a link up, so because of this, we may change the order of the speakers. President Manconi. Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to you all. This major question of human rights over the past decades has been deeply redefined. And this because of many factors, and I would like to stress 2 of these that have a direct link, very direct link, with the topic for this morning. I will do this as concisely as possible, and therefore I can't go into every detail. For the past 15 years now, the traditional distinction between economic migrants and asylum seekers has become more and more uncertain and difficult to define. At the moment, it is analytically impossible to define. In particular, if we look at the latest flows of migrants that have reached Europe and our country, that distinction really does appear very difficult to define. And another thing that is very closely linked with this issue of redefining this category of human rights is the fact that the movements or flows of individuals who leave areas of the world that are very varied and come to Europe lead to the heart of our democratic systems. And within these systems that are defined rules of law, they bring with them the question of the safeguard of human rights that becomes a very topical and local issue. This is important because I think economic migrants who seek asylum when they reach democratic Western countries are, or can be defined initially as, or from the point of view of an element of absence, and that is they do not have a citizenship system. They do not have the prerequisite, the condition sine qua non, which, according to the traditional words of Hannah Arendt, say they do not have the right to rights. So within our democratic states, we recognize the need for protection of fundamental rights, and we recognize that this is absolutely essential for the dignity of persons and their right to life. And this means that the issue of human rights drastically loses any exotic nuance and any anachronistical form. The question of human rights becomes a very contemporary issue and even more developed within our democratic states. So these are the elements that have redefined this issue in the last decades. If we use this first simple consideration on the question which is our topic for today, when a policy for European common migration, when will we see a European common migration and asylum policy? I would like to turn this round and consider the issue not starting from us, from the heart of Europe, but rather from the south of the south, that is to say, the Mediterranean, the Sicilian Channel, and Africa, those countries from which we see the flow of migrants. Right, so if we take the issue of a common migration and asylum policy from the point of view of those who are leaving that part of the world, well, here and now, in the urgency for an ineluctable sequence of emergencies we have to face, if we look at it from this point of view, I think there are two main passages and two main steps that are an ineluctable premise for the development of any common policy. First essential step is the drawing up of what we've called a humanitarian accession, which includes all the projects, the actions, the measures underway at the moment on the part of various subjects that everyone is trying to preempt within the migration flow transit countries. That is to say, to ask for international protection in transit. This is an idea that has been defined in different ways and expressed in different ways of pre-settling or pre-settlement or humanitarian corridors or humanitarian entry, which means it offers the possibility to European countries to organize in the areas where these migrants transit, to organize international bodies made up of various bodies, UN agencies, EU bodies, international humanitarian organizations that already in the transit areas would be able to start distributing to asylum seekers a visa which would allow them to reach Europe through a legal and secure channels and means, avoiding the Mediterranean Sea's dangers. I believe that despite the great political difficulty there is in developing this, I think this is the most reasonable and concrete proposal. Second step, and I conclude with this one, we have before us a deadline. A deadline that some see very close, which is the definition of the destiny of Mare Nostrum. And a form of replacement for it that should be Frontex Plus. Well, here I think there's a serious danger. The Frontex Plus project has a very limited objective and has a scope that is very limited, that would run the risk of leaving international waters uncovered. And this is the area where this operation has been most useful and effective recently. So the second step is, when in talking about a European policy, is this: replace Mare Nostrum with a supranational mission which would cover international waters to pursue the activity carried out up to now by Mare Nostrum. And I conclude by saying that this operation has, for Italy, represented, and it could represent for the whole of Europe, has represented and can represent in the future the best way of saving the 140,000 human lives. And all this represented an extraordinary opportunity, proved by the reactions, the behavior, of our Navy, are the cosmopolitan and pro-European feeling that for once has shown fragments, traces of a possible European identity. This ghost that we all pursue, this European identity, not restricted to financial activities. Well, here we have a small manifestation of it within this operation and its results. And I think for the first time we have had before us the feeling of a sort of collective pride based not only on military action, but on the meaning itself of a supranational creation, which is centered upon human beings and human dignity. Thank you, Chair President Manconi, and now I give the floor to Minister Alfano. I would ask all the speakers, if possible, to speak 10 minutes each.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I will do my best to keep to the 10-minute time allotment, even though I have a lot to say. First of all, allow me to greet and welcome all of the representatives of the committee specialised in fundamental rights who are here in Rome. There is an extremely important task for the European Union because cooperation at a parliamentary level is as important as intergovernmental cooperation. Mr. Manconi, who preceded me, used very clear words to describe the concept of the right to asylum. The title of this session is Towards a True European Common Migration and Asylum Policy. So, in order to avoid repeating concepts that he has already illustrated, I will focus specifically on the topic of migration. And it is a true privilege for me to have the opportunity to inform you about the outcome of the Justice and Home Affairs Council, which was held last week in Luxembourg. This was an extremely important council meeting. I chaired it, and the Italian presidency submitted on that occasion a document which was only approved a few days ago, and I assume that it is not as yet fully known to European parliaments. Only this morning I forwarded to the chairpersons of specialised committees in our parliament a copy of the document that we approved during that council meeting. In practice, in order to respond in a structural fashion to migration pressure and in line with the Italian presidency's commitment, this document was submitted to the council meeting in Luxembourg, and it is entitled Actions Required for a Better Management of Migration Flows. We feel that this is an innovative approach to develop a sustainable and flexible management system in the face of migration flows, and member states responded so positively that this document was included in the Council's conclusions. So this is not a working hypothesis that I'm going to illustrate. It is actually a document that was included in the final statement of the council meeting, which was held in Luxembourg. The three pillars of this document are cooperation with third countries, specifically in order to combat those responsible for trafficking in human beings and migrant smuggling. It also aims to ensure that Frontex is well equipped to respond to growing pressure, and thirdly, it focuses on the action that is required at a European level to promote greater operational cooperation in view of a common European asylum system. This is a strategic and operational approach, and it is based on the activities of the Task Force Mediterranean, with the aim of ensuring a flexible implementation of this process in order to adequately manage migration flows. There are two remarks that I would like to make. Firstly, I would like to say a few words about the Task Force Mediterranean. Exactly a year ago, I was in a similar context as I have just described, the Justice and Home Affairs Council, 2 days after the tragedy in Lampedusa, and I was born very close to Lampedusa. In other words, my province ends where international waters begin and where Europe ends. So on that occasion, I found myself forced to describe the tragedy that had occurred in Lampedusa, and I also reported that there was one particularly tragic death, that of a woman whose baby was still attached to her umbilical cord. And on that occasion, I proposed that a task force be established. And fortunately, thanks to the cooperation of many countries, this task force has delivered. And these results have been very concrete indeed. We have been able to achieve important results, and this is an example of how Europe was united and ready to act. Unfortunately, this happened in the aftermath of an emergency, whereas our strategy should be that of ensuring that Europe is always ready to act and is present irrespective of whether a tragedy occurs or not. But 1 year on, this document that we submitted includes the work of the Task Force Mediterranean, which was, as we said, the result of the JHA Council held in Luxembourg last year. The second point I would like to make refers to Frontex. the pressure that has built up along the Bulgarian, Turkish, Greek-Turkish borders now moved to the Mediterranean, and at the same time instability along the eastern border, Ukraine, and the growing threats in Iraq and in the Silk Road, and the flows in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans, are all contexts that have to be closely monitored because they could give rise to new pressures that Europe must be ready to respond to in a timely and effective fashion. In concrete, the three key elements of this document are cooperation with third countries, and that's the first pillar. The second pillar is the enhancement of Frontex and action within the European Union to provide an effective, consistent support to our common asylum system. With regard to cooperation with third countries, we believe that priority should be given to countries of origin or transit to flows in Africa and the Middle East, without forgetting the Asian countries of the so-called Silk Road, as I mentioned earlier, especially Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in particular. Immediate initiatives should be targeted to preventing departures and consequently deaths at sea. Out of the various initiatives, allow me to mention in particular law enforcement action to enhance third countries' capability to adequately monitor their borders, also thanks to technical assistance programs, support given to liaison officers to promote an exchange of information, and the use of joint investigation teams to fight the criminal organizations that engage in people smuggling and exploitation of illegal migrants. Allow me to add that during the Mare Nostrum operation, Italian law enforcement bodies arrested over 500 people smugglers and traffickers. There are other equally important operations, those that are envisaged by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to target the need for protection and development in North Africa, Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. And I would also like to mention another important initiative, the Assisted Voluntary Return Programme managed by the International Organization for Migrations. These initiatives that cannot replace long-term measures contribute to stabilizing migrant communities, dismantle the criminal organizations that exploit smuggling of migrants and trafficking of human beings. They also reduce the number of perilous attempts at crossing the sea and consequent deaths, and incentivate third countries to implement closer cooperation with the UE in the area of migration according to the principle of more for more. So with regard to Frontex, obviously all member states have a keen interest to ensure that our external borders are safe, and therefore we must all cooperate with Frontex to consolidate its presence in the central Mediterranean, which is the weak link in the external borders of the EU. And this is why we will launch in early November a new joint operation called Triton, and once this occurs, Mare Nostrum will be phased out. This Italian document, which was enshrined in the conclusions of the Justice and Home Affairs Council meeting, envisages that Frontex's operational capabilities be strengthened in order to streamline procedures for the identification of migrants, collection of data, screening of vulnerable cases, screening of people in need of medical care, all of this to be able to immediately meet their needs upon arrival. Strengthening Frontex does not in any way impact the nature of the agency, which continues to have a civilian role, because Frontex is still a civilian operation, and it confirms and enhances the European Union's commitment to patrol and ensure that our common borders are secure. I would like to make a final point in conclusion. The topic of strengthening Frontex along our borders seems to be considered as identical to operations in the Mediterranean Sea. But if we look at what happens along our eastern borders, what is happening in the Balkans, we know that an operation in the central Mediterranean in a situation of emergency is a precedent for the possibility for Frontex to act along all of the other borders. Hopefully this will not be necessary, but we should not overlook the eastern border, which could be faced with growing pressure. So strengthening a common border, enhancing the capabilities of Frontex, which is the agency that has been established to this end, means that a political continent that has decided to remove all its internal borders that were the result of the last World War, that were removed thanks to Schengen, is a mechanism that can enable us to ensure that our external borders are secure. There is no confederation of states in the world that, when it becomes a union or federation of states, has chosen to eliminate external border, or eliminate internal borders, and not make sure that its external borders are adequately protected and safeguarded. So I think this is an aspect that our citizens are requiring us to guarantee. So with regard to our common European asylum system, I would like to point out that this is based on effective cooperation and solidarity among all member states, which on the one hand must guarantee that there is a flexible national system for reception and asylum capable of responding to sudden increase in flows, but at the same time these systems must be ready to provide the Eurodac data bank fingerprints to allow identification of the country of first entry, and to avoid that migrants may slip through, let's say, this identification process. On the basis of this document, we know that it's essential for fingerprints to be taken as quickly as possible and ensure that those who refuse to give their fingerprints can then flee. The important point is that we have to do this while respecting fundamental rights, even when it comes to taking fingerprints. Another point is that migrants upon arrival must be immediately informed of their rights and duties and the consequences that are linked to a refusal to be identified. The importance of the document that has just been adopted is also seen by the integration of all the European structures involved in its implementation, and this can trigger virtuous circles promoting mutual trust and enhancing the level of cooperation. We believe that it is only with a truly common and European approach based on solidarity that it'll be possible for us to identify a credible, sustainable and effective European common asylum and migration policy. And this is only possible provided that we engage in a virtuous common approach based on the two basic principles underlying the union: solidarity and responsibility. Solidarity and responsibility are particularly significant in the area of migration. So solidarity and responsibility must be intertwined. These are the two basic pillars, solidarity and responsibility, because we all know that this is not just about an emergency situation. What we're seeing is structural to our time and age, and therefore governments and parliaments must be up to this challenge. A huge challenge. And within this challenge, a fundamental role is played by the European Union. The European Union must be capable of managing this huge challenge wisely. We hope that the Italian presidency has given a significant contribution, and we very much hope that once the various points envisaged in this document are implemented, the European Union will become stronger thanks to the fact that it will have successfully managed one of the most difficult challenges of our times. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. We have video link now with François Crépeau. So we would like to invite him to make his presentation now, to deliver his presentation now. Welcome.
Prego.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this invitation to address your August Assembly as you're deliberating on a very important topic. I'm sorry not to be able to be with you in person, and thank you for organizing this video link. I hope that my presentation can contribute to shaping the important decisions that you have to take. My central point is that if Europe is to witness a significant reduction of human suffering at its borders, it must bank not on strict document migrants and increase the precariousness of the migrant situation, resulting in more deaths at sea and more human rights violations. Despite excellent initiatives like the increase in search and rescue operations, which have saved numerous lives, such as the Mare Nostrum operation, for which Italy must be commended, some European member states continue to officially advocate repression of irregular migration and haven't yet opened new legal channels of migration, thus limiting the possibilities for asylum seekers to regularly reach safe destinations and for low-wage migrants to respond to the needs of the EU labour market. Consequently, the number of migrants risking their lives on unseaworthy vessels over perilous sea routes can only increase. The UN estimates that more than 130,000 migrants have arrived in Europe by sea this year, compared to 80,000 last year. They migrate due to the push factors in their countries of origin, which may include war, conflict, natural disaster, persecution, extreme poverty, but they also migrate in response to pull factors, such as the unrecognized needs of the labor markets in EU member states, as migrants are often willing to do the dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs that nationals will not, at the exploitative wages that unscrupulous employers will offer, including in the construction, agriculture, hospitality, and caregiving sectors. I have met many of those migrants in my various country visits, including to Italy. Migrants don't believe they are doing anything wrong. They believe, and rightly so in my mind, that they're only doing it to find either protection against violence or a job to support their family. Who can say that such survival strategies are wrong? We would probably do the same if we were in their shoes. We don't have the moral high ground on this issue. Repressive policies failed to deter irregular migration because hope is always stronger, because despite what happened to others, or even what happened to themselves in a previous attempt, they believe that next time will be the right time and that they'll make it. And criminal rings take advantage of that hope. Any attempt at sealing borders, preventing irregular migrants from entering the EU, as the nationalist populist discourse stridently calls for, will continue to fail on a massive scale. Sealing international borders is actually impossible, as Italy has recognized with the Mare Nostrum operation, and migrants will continue to arriving despite all efforts to stop them, and at a terrible cost in lives and in suffering. Currently, migrants themselves, most often with the help of smugglers, are crossing borders regardless of state policies. They see no other option but to migrate irregularly due to a lack of legal migration channels, particularly for asylum seekers and low-wage migrant workers. With time, continued repression of irregular migration is actually counterproductive, as it drives migrants further underground, thereby empowering smuggling rings and creating conditions of alienation and marginalization that foster human rights violations, such as discrimination and violence against migrants. Global North states can thus be seen as co-responsible for creating conditions that encourage smuggling and make it more dangerous. While it needs to continue attempting to bring unscrupulous smugglers to trial for the suffering they inflict on migrants, Europe will not succeed at fighting resourceful and adaptable criminal rings unless it destroys their business model, which was created when barriers were erected and which thrives at evading repressive European migration policies. In the 50s and 60s, many migrants came from North Africa through the Mediterranean, and no one died because mobility was actually more important. Europe needs less repression of survival migration and more harm reduction policies, taking as a central concern the well-being of migrants. Europe must bank on mobility across the Mediterranean in both directions as a dynamic factor of economic and social development, opening, over a period of time, safe legal channels for migration and mobility on a much bigger scale would allow for, inter alia, the registration of all migrants, which the minister called for just in the previous presentation, for identifying protection needs, for providing information on labor markets and the risks of irregular migration. This would mean that most migrants would find legal ways to enter Europe, and that European countries would therefore reclaim the control of border crossings from the smuggling rings. In the meantime, the increase in search and rescue operational capacity has been a very positive initiative which has saved many lives. I urge the European Union to continue strengthening this capacity while respecting the principle of non-refoulement, guaranteeing immediate disembarkation of asylum seekers and migrants at the nearest port, providing information, care and support to migrants, processing equitably the asylum claims, and encouraging commercial vessels to carry out rescue operations without risk of retaliation or harassment due to them being considered as accessory to smuggling operations. More concerted effort is also required from European member states to assist the frontline states such as Italy, Greece, Malta, and Spain. The search and rescue programs cannot be the sole responsibility of frontline countries. With the current surge in migration, the European Union should ensure that there are sufficient reception centres with adequate facilities to accommodate the new arrivals. Upon arrival at port or country of destination, and in collaboration with civil society organizations, asylum seekers and migrants should have access to medical care, psychosocial support, legal counsel, after which individual assessments should be implemented to determine their protection needs. The immigration procedures need to be clear, explained in a language that the asylum seeker or migrant understands, and fair and efficient. Although European law under the Return Directive provides that detention for the purpose of preparing deportation proceedings should be a measure of last resort, I have observed in my country visits that within the discourse of securitization of migration and border control, the systematic detention of irregular migrants, often for very long periods of time, has come to be viewed by many European member states as a legitimate tool of migration management, despite the lack of any evidence that detention serves as a deterrent. In my research and country visits, I have witnessed inadequate procedures for detention including the failure to respect legal, procedural, and substantive guarantees, the useless detention of persons without prospect of removal, and the useless detention of children and families. States have failed to implement non-custodial alternatives to detention in favor of migrants when such methods have proven to be efficient and less costly. Similarly, return procedures, particularly when facilitated through readmission agreements, failed to provide the necessary human rights safeguards. There is also an urgent need to allow migrants to circulate within the EU to where they can be reunited with their families or find a job and start contributing to their new communities. Trying to confine them to the territory of frontline countries obliges migrants to continue traveling underground, further empowering criminal rings and unscrupulous employers, and places undue responsibilities on such frontline countries. I urge, therefore, the EU to establish a human rights-based, coherent, and comprehensive migration policy which takes these issues into account and makes mobility its central asset. This policy should address the push factors by working together with the international organizations to continue to provide humanitarian and development programs in countries of origin. But pull factors for irregular migrations, such as the unrecognized needs for migrant workers in European underground labor markets, should also be addressed. States should recognize their real labor needs, including for low-wage work in agriculture or construction. This means that they should, on the one hand, open up many more regular migration channels, and on the other hand, repress unscrupulous employers who exploit the fear of asylum seekers and undocumented migrants to be detected, detained, and deported. Effectively implementing the Employer Sanction Directive, for example, should be a priority. Combining such policies would lead to smaller underground labor markets, less irregular border crossings, less smuggling of migrants, less loss of life at borders, less labor exploitation, and less migrants' rights violations. In this new human rights-based common immigration policy, access to justice for all migrants is also key if Europe really wants their rights to be respected, protected, and promoted. In the recent past, the European Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice, national courts and tribunals, as well as national human rights institutions and ombudspersons, have shown their willingness to defend the rights of migrants. Facilitating access to justice by migrants without fear of detection, detention, deportation, in order to help them fight for their rights, would go a long way towards, on the one hand, legitimizing such migration policies through showing that territorial sovereignty and human rights are not incompatible or a zero-sum game. And on the other hand, changing mentalities regarding migration through fighting nationalist fantasies and populist stereotypes. A human rights-based approach is also required in order to address the issue of asylum seekers. I urge EU member states to work with UNHCR in order to provide durable solutions for asylum seekers. This would indeed contribute to reducing the number of people who have recourse to smuggling operations and would help EU member states regain control of their borders. We cannot leave millions of refugees at the EU borders and not expect them to try to cross border to create a future for their family. Of course, states have the power to admit, deny entry, or to return migrants, but they equally have an obligation to respect the human rights of all migrants in the process. While it may constitute an administrative offense, irregular migration is not a crime, neither against persons, nor against property, nor against state security, as in their vast majority, migrants are harmless and hardworking. Although they may have violated an administrative requirement, irregular migrants are not criminals per se and should not be treated as such. And that is a very important point. Terminology is important in this respect. Migrants may be irregular or in an irregular situation, but they're not illegal. And all European institutions must stop using this terminology. Incorrect terminology contributes to negative discourses on migration, reinforces negative stereotypes against migrants, legitimates a nationalist populist discourse of fantasized threats and risks, which in turn contributes to further alienation, marginalization, discrimination, and violence against migrants. This is exacerbated by legislation in some countries which criminalizes the provision of assistance to irregular migrants, including in relation to the provision of health services or housing. Criminalization is often linked to anti-migrant sentiments and inappropriate language. There is a need for a political counter-discourse that would emphasize the benefits that migration brings to both countries of origin and destination. However, this counter-discourse will have difficulty emerging as long as migrants do not have access to the political stage. They cannot voice their concerns and fight stereotypes, as, for example, women have accessed the political stage, voiced their concerns, and fought sexist stereotyping in the past 50 years. Migrants cannot provide the politicians who would defend their rights with an electoral incentive, with votes in the next election. Until migrants are given a voice in the political debates on migration policies, Europe must therefore fight much more vigorously racism, xenophobia, and hate crime, as well as focus on saving lives and ensuring mobility, consolidating the common human rights culture that is now framing the evolution of all traditions, and celebrating the diversity of cultures and religion as an enrichment for everyone, citizens and foreigners alike. I'm looking very much forward to coming to Italy for a second follow-up official visit next December and to discussing with Italian authorities how to regain control of borders while better protecting the human rights of migrants. And I thank you for your kind attention.
La ringraziamo molto per la sua relazione. Volevamo...
Thank you very much for your presentation. Or can you hear us? I wanted to ask François Crépeau whether he could stay with us to listen to the comments to his presentation and maybe respond afterwards. Thank you.
Do adesso la parola a Robert
And I now give the floor to Robert Visser, who is Executive Director of the European Asylum Support Office. 10 minutes, I remind you.
Thank you, Madam President, Honourable Presidents, Members of Senate and Chamber of Deputies, Honourable Minister Alfano. We see each other every week in the same subject. It's a true pleasure and honour for me to be here today and to give you some of the remarks from my side, which is the side of a European agency dealing with asylum, the main topic of this session. I think that the title of the session is very well chosen, Towards a True European Common Migration and Asylum Policy. And let me pick three elements as a key for my contribution. First, the word towards, meaning that we are on the way, that we haven't reached, but certainly we are moving. Second, common or European, we are in it together, jointly. And thirdly, true, meaning not only paperwork, not only Brussels declarations, but real operational, practical reality. And I think those three elements are excellent summary of the context of the framework that Europe is trying to set up. And let me start by the road towards the road to European policy, common European policy. We are so used in Europe to be self-critic that we sometimes forget to see and look around what we have. Let me phrase a very unsuspected source. The American Director General of the International Organization of Migration, the IOM, who very recently said very few regions face greater migration challenges than Europe, and very few regions in the world have devoted more thought and resources to migration issues than Europe. It's good to realize it. Being critical, we're far from perfect, for sure. We have lots of things and steps to take. But it's also good, just for a moment, to realize that we have already done quite a lot, and that we have really set up a system on which to be proud. And once again, I say it's far from perfect. It's only phase 2 of the asylum system. Many phases still have to come, but also, to be honest, we only started 10 years ago. We only started common policy 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was anathema, it was not a subject of European discussion at all. It was a purely national subject. So let's reflect just for a second and then go on to the future. Where are we now at this moment? We have the asylum package phase 2. The European Parliament last year agreed on that package. That package already is a big step forward. It provides more harmonized standards, it provides harmonized procedures, and it provides a legal framework that is a real next step. We have a new Commission and a new President of the European Council. We have strategic guidelines. We have since last week the document of Minister Alfano. So we have a lot of building blocks to go into that way forward. What is the reality at this moment? Where are we when we look at migration and asylum? Last year, we saw a 30% rise of asylum seekers in Europe. And already in the first 6-7 months, we see an increasing number, increasing over last year's number, which was the highest since the start of our data collection. So yes, there is absolutely something to deal with, something to realize, and something to recognize. It is, and I was very happy what Minister Alfano said on this point, it is a situation that is recognized in the south, in the Mediterranean, but absolutely we also have a very long and very, in the end, vulnerable east border. Vulnerable meaning easy accessible. If we look at the different places, the different countries of origin of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, then we see, of course, Syria. Syria is now for already quite some time the biggest number of asylum seekers ever registered from one country. And for good reasons. I don't need to explain that. Television and other media present us the images from day to day. The second one is Iraq. Now, more and more, and I would say on a daily basis, becoming a more vivid image and also a threatening image to a certain extent. Eritrea is an increasing number, quite unexplainable actually. The situation in Eritrea has been very bad for many years, and the last half year it has not, in Eritrea itself, not really changed, but the numbers have changed enormously. Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Western Balkan is one of the major sources of influx in the European Union. And then, of course, the Ukraine with the big question mark of what will happen in our east border very close. Only to underline that it is south and east together, and that we certainly should not isolate the discussion, but get a discussion on the level of what, as Europe, can we do. Let's look a second to the word common and European. The common European asylum system is a framework of rules and rights and procedures. And as on a national level, we are very much used to look from our national asylum law, our national migration law, and knowing that somewhere in that bigger picture there is European elements. The reality is actually by now in the phase 2 the other way around. We have created a European legal framework, and the member states have to stay within that framework. They can have their national law a little bit this way, a little bit that way. There are choices to make, but the choices are within that framework. So if we want to make new steps, and also in that I fully support the Italian presidency, if we want to make next steps, we should be aware that we should take those steps in the context of that EU legal framework. It is a living framework. It is not a statical international treaty like we have in other areas. Europe is a legal and living animal, I would say, and it is changeable. We have good institutions, we have Commission, Council, Parliament who constantly adapt and update the system. So it is possible. It is very well possible, and the lively debate last week in Luxembourg during lunch only underlines this. I will, with a look on the clock, be very short about the most important thing. What are we actually doing on the ground? EASO is an agency established to provide operational and practical support for member states, Commission, Parliament, etc. To build a European culture, because what we really want with those legal frameworks is to have similar situations treated with a similar procedure and with a similar outcome, being it in Italy, in Spain, in Finland, in Austria, or you name it. That is the reason why we have a law, that the law is applied in the same way at all places. For that reason, we provide common training, common information of countries of origin. We have set up an early warning system, and we provide very practical operational support to a number of member states that ask that and have specific needs. We're active on the ground in Greece, in Bulgaria, where we see the problem of the east border, in Cyprus, and very much in Italy itself. And in that case, speaking about the day-to-day subject of the Mediterranean, I'm actually in full discussion with the Italian authorities on a project on setting up a large-scale project in Sicily, and I hope that Minister Alfano and I very soon will be able to sign it. I think it's a very balanced package between the Mediterranean needs, rightly so, they are in a very special situation, and needs from other member states of the European Union using the Dublin system, using family unification, accelerated procedures, a number of practical approaches for the very imminent discussion. Also, I should mention, being here in Italy, the very good cooperation we have with Italy and Malta on the subject of facilitators. We know that certainly in the Mediterranean, 99, maybe even 100% of all those coming by little or bigger boats are organized by networks, probably criminal networks. And to get a better view on that phenomenon, not exactly to tackle each individual, that is more police and Europol work, but to get a better view of that phenomenon and to understand it better, to cope with it better, we have a project both with Italy and with Malta to look into those phenomena. Finally, solidarity. Europe should become a single area of protection. Principles of responsibility, mutual trust, and solidarity are key. Solidarity is certainly not charity. That is not what Europe is about. Europe is about an adult organization that respects each other and where every partner should take its own responsibility. That's where it starts. If the partners don't take their own responsibility, don't apply the acquis, there is no starting point. But certainly, Europe has organized quite an extensive range of tools of solidarity, financial, legally, etc. And beside that, a possibility of using solidarity tools like operational agencies, like Frontex, like EASO, like Europol, and like others. Responsibility of each partner leads to mutual trust, and mutual trust leads to more solidarity. I think those are intimately linked, and I think those are the key to the common future, the key towards a true common European asylum system. Thank you very much.
Molte grazie.
Thank you very much. And now over to Elizabeth Collett, Director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to the Chamber of Deputies for the invitation to be here today. I'm deeply honoured for the opportunity to speak to you. I have the broad remit of speaking about how the EU can manage third country national migration to the EU, which is a topic I can speak 10 hours about, not 10 minutes, but I will try to be restrained, and I'm sure you'll be relieved not to be here till this evening. I want to focus on the management of mixed flows to the European Union, and particularly the external dimension, which I think has been the focus of much of our discussion. And I think the question that was asked in the opening remarks, can a more coherent foreign policy for the European Union support or hinder a coherent migration policy for the European Union, really speaks to the overarching challenge the EU will have to face in the next years. The management of mixed flows is the greatest challenge the EU will face, but it's also the area of greatest uncertainty about how far the EU can respond. There's been much discussion in recent months about the future of the European Union's policy in this area, culminating in the strategic guidelines which were produced in the June Council of the European Union. But this conversation takes place in a broader context of skepticism, both about the European Union project itself and immigration to the EU, uncertainty about the EU's own economic and social future, and multiple and proliferating humanitarian crises in the neighbourhood of Europe. And in this context, the EU plays a difficult role as being seen as the sole saviour and answer to all these problems, and also the root cause of many of them. It is in some ways seen as both, sometimes by different actors, sometimes the same actors. And these perceptions and these political challenges obscure a core question. What should the EU be doing to manage the flows of third country nationals to Europe? And how far can the EU realistically extend its responsibility to protect those undertaking the dangerous journey to Europe's borders? For those resident in the EU already, the mandate, I think, is clear and has been set out by Robert Visser. The EU has set standards for member states, both within the context of the common European asylum system, but also rules for legal migration to the European Union and the treatment and processes for those who have lost their right to remain within the European Union. The EU has started to put in place mechanisms to monitor the compliance of member states, sometimes driven by a realization that some member states have been failing in their obligations, and the European Asylum Support Office plays a key role in this and will do in the future. And individual rights of migrants can be adjudicated through national courts, the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. This is cumbersome machinery and there is often uneven access, but the framework for that adjudication exists. Additional efforts here are definitely needed, particularly with respect to implementation and improving access to the broader range of rights that migrants should be allowed, which include labour and social rights, and for those that the member states give legal residence to. But for those seeking to come to the European Union, the mandate for the European Union is far less clear. Whether beginning a journey from across the globe, starting in a refugee camp or in a country of origin, or getting on a boat on the Libyan coast, the EU responsibility and desire to act has been both become uncertain and deeply contested. One thing is clear. Once on a boat, the EU's imperative to act is without doubt certain. There has been much discussion in recent months about whether the Italian initiative, which should be praised deeply, to search and rescue in the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum operation, has turned out to be a pull factor for many of those traveling across the Mediterranean. It may be so, it may not be so, and that is a contested fact, but it is also an irrelevant fact. Once people are in that kind of situation, the responsibility to protect those people trumps all other considerations and policy goals. Once in the European Union, however, the corollary of this is to have credible systems of adjudication that can effectively determine the legitimacy of each individual to remain within the European Union. And within that context, it has to be possible for member states to say no as well as yes. But beyond this, what is the European Union's role? And I think here is where the foreign policy issue becomes increasingly relevant. There has been focus in recent months, particularly of interior actors, home affairs actors, on the upstream prevention of movements in third countries. How can we address smuggling and trafficking in third countries? And the document that Minister Alfano set out elaborates how the European Union can work with third countries on these issues. There are a broad range of responses encapsulated in this document, from limiting the supply of boats from Tunisia and Egypt to offering greater protection in the regions of origin through regional development and protection programs. But the EU has multiple goals and imperatives that are located at various moments in the migration journey and don't always cohere. For development actors within the European Union who have significant resources, they work on an extremely long-term approach in countries of origin, investing in improving conditions overall socioeconomically so that people are not forced to leave their home countries or sense that they are forced to leave their home countries, but have the opportunity to make a life there. Humanitarian actors, by contrast, look at addressing immediate needs for those who have been displaced by conflict or other disaster situations, and look to protect people in origin. They work on a short-term basis, which has unfortunately in recent years, due to the protracted nature of conflicts and other situations around the world, become increasingly long-term in nature. Foreign policy actors, again by contrast, look at mobility in the context of the broad range of issues when establishing a basis for cooperation with a third country. They look at the context of security, trade, and environment. They often look at the opportunity to offer visa facilitation with a third country as an incentive to deepen cooperation on other bases with those corporations. But for interior actors who are focused on migration and asylum policies, they have a different set of priorities: the management of borders and flows to those borders. Mixed flows of asylum seekers and irregular migrants represent a challenge to this imperative. And one has to ask the question whether the goal for interior ministers is to prevent the flow itself or to protect the individual from harm. This has created a number of mixed messages for third countries. And I think one of the critical issues that the EU will have to work out over the next few years is what the priority number one is. Is it a short-term prevention of flows in third countries and limit the actions of facilitators such as smugglers and traffickers, but also complicit governments themselves? Or in the long term, to build credible systems of immigration and asylum and protection in third countries, and where that is not possible, reduce harms to individuals? Which of these take priority, and are these two priorities both capable of being implemented simultaneously? I should note that it also takes, when we have these discussions, we talk about government actions. We rarely consider the individuals involved in these journeys. And one thing that is underestimated, I think, by most European Union actors are the extraordinary risks that migrants are willing to take to reach Europe. Migrants are willing to gamble away their fundamental rights in order to try and reach the borders of Europe. We make assumptions based on our own risk analysis. If someone was to tell us there was a 1 in 1,000 chance we wouldn't reach our destination, you or I would not undertake the journey. If you tell a migrant there is a 1 in 5 chance he won't reach his destination, he may still undertake that journey. That suggests to me two very difficult things for the European Union to address. One, that there is something deeply wrong in either the country of origin or the country of first protection that drives people to acknowledge the information they're given and still be willing to take the risk. And two, that European Union responses, based on our own understanding of migration dynamics and which policies may work, may be wrong-headed. I speak here, one of the EU's greatest investments to date has been in information programs for migrants, on the understanding that if migrants only knew how dangerous it was, they wouldn't undertake the journey. The evidence to date suggests that's not true. They understand the risks, they absorb the risks, and they still undertake that journey. So I just want to conclude with a few comments about where the EU needs to go. I think there still needs to be a clear vision of long-term goals and a recognition that attempting to achieve everything with respect to migration policy in third countries may lead the EU to realize, in real terms, very little. How far can the European Union protect, and where can it protect? What are the short and long-term goals? I found this was something that was missing from the strategic guidelines that were set out from the European Union. I respect deeply phrases like solidarity and burden sharing, but they have begun to become problematic when member states can't even agree on the basic definitions and substance of those terms. There are an enormous range of activities, what we would call in the UK a kitchen sink approach to actions in third countries, a range of activities in member states which don't always look like cooperation with third countries, but interventions with third countries. And we have to look at very much more clearly at what is desirable and what is possible. Are we talking about lowering the numbers arriving in the European Union or protecting migrant groups as a whole? And are indeed both possible? And secondly, possibly more importantly, what level of resources is the European Union willing to invest in these goals? Are the resources to be directed towards long-term development programs, shorter-term humanitarian support, or the perhaps even shorter-term interventions to reduce the flows towards Europe? This comes hand in hand with an issue of leadership. There is a dearth of leadership in many countries across the European Union and at European Union level. External diplomacy on migration issues must reach the highest level, the head of state level. The EU has to extend beyond the instruments it has created, such as mobility partnerships and readmission agreements, and discuss the global responsibilities within Europe, but also within third countries, and within a broader foreign policy debate. And to come back to the question that was asked by the chair at the beginning of this session about a coherent foreign policy, I think there is certainly a role for migration to be more strongly integrated within the external relations activities of the European Union as a whole, and specifically a strong role for the new High Representative. She should speak on this issue at the highest level, but there should also be a very pragmatic understanding that while migration issues are the highest priority for many interior officials, for foreign policy actors, they are juggling a range of priorities, and migration may not always be the number one issue on the agenda. So we must reconcile our rhetoric about what is desirable to achieve within the European Union on external action on migration and what we can pragmatically achieve on the ground. Thank you.
La ringrazio molto e ringrazio tutti i relatori.
I would like to thank you and all of the other speakers for their very interesting remarks. We have 10 people who have requested to speak. Each colleague will have 3 minutes, which will make it possible for others to be added to the list if necessary, and then we'll have time for the answers. Alev Korun Ostra is the first.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
È una signora.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Talking about the topic, we have to remember, I think, that since the summit of Tampere, since 1999, we have been speaking in the EU about the common migration and asylum policy. And although we all know that there are already a number of directives at the moment which have been worked on since 1999, we are far away from a common and sustainable migration and asylum policy. This is also the truth which we have to deal with. I think one of the biggest problems reaching a common migration and asylum policy is the illusion in which many European countries and also the EU itself still lives in, that a migration system could work when you more or less close the borders, try to control the borders. If you think that a migration system only consists of migration flows with people who are in a very high job profile. And here I want to support the things Mr. Crepeau was talking about, that we, for a functioning common migration system, we need more realistic and also open channels of migration. It is a fact that Europe also needs workers from third countries, and we actually are all profiters of the common migration system, because if we buy our fruits and vegetables every day in our supermarkets in the EU, in different European countries, we all are profiting from the fact that these fruits and vegetables can be that cheap because of the exploitation of migrant workers. And we are all aware of the fact that so-called undocumented migrants have been working in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, and picking up our fruits and vegetables. So for a sustainable and common migration system, we need realistic channels. We have to deal with the facts of migration today and not still live in the illusion that such a migration system which we have now could work. And concerning asylum, we are all pitying the fact that thousands of refugees drowned in the Mediterranean in the last years. Of course, it's very good that there is this project to save lives of refugees today, but we all know, or many of us should know actually, that our European policy, trying to keep away refugees from the European Union, is very much supporting the human smugglers. And also in this theme, I would like to support the thoughts of Mr. Crepeau, who was talking about destroying the business model of smugglers and traffickers. And if the EU continues to support via this migration policy we have been making the last years, human smugglers and traffickers, then at the same time saying, oh, you know, we have to fight human smuggling and trafficking, it will not be very sustainable, and it will show no positive outcomes, unfortunately. And the last thing to say is that for a common sustainable asylum policy, we would need a total change of the so-called Dublin system, because the Dublin system leaves away a few countries such as Italy, Spain, Malta, Greece, and Cyprus, with all the responsibility of almost all refugees coming into the EU. Instead of the Dublin system, we would need a fair system of welcoming, caring, and distributing refugees according to population numbers of the European countries, but also according to wealth of the European countries. If we stay with the Dublin system, I'm afraid also in the next years we will not have shared responsibility, and we will still have many people drowning in the Mediterranean. So it is on us, on politicians, and on and the people politically in charge to change this migration and asylum system to have a realistic and really sustainable and common asylum and migration policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I would like to remind you all that you only have 2.5 minutes to speak, because there are more requests for the floor. Over to Buran Kuzul, Turkey.
Göç günümüzün en önemli sorunlarından biri haline gelmiştir.
Immigration has become one of the most important issues of our time.
Tablo çok kötüdür. Mayınlı araziler, soğuktan donma, suda boğulmalar vesaire.
And the current outlook does not provide a optimistic view because most of the immigrants and asylum seekers lose their lives on mined fields and bad weather conditions.
Birleşmiş Milletler verilerine göre 2005 yılında dünyada toplam 191 milyon kişi göçmen durumundadır.
According to the data of United Nations, as of 2005, more than 191 million people are in the status of immigrants.
Avrupa Birliği'nin genelde Avrupa'nın konuya bakışı korunaklı kale Avrupası mantığına dayanmaktadır.
We observe that the European Union's general approach is based on Fortress Europe concept.
Bu mantık Nazi Almanyası'nın uyguladığı mantık olduğundan eleştirilmektedir.
And this logic is being criticized because it resembles some views of the ex-Nazi regime.
2000'lerden sonra Avrupa Birliği'nde konu kriminal bir sorun haline gelmiş ve göçmenler suçlu muamelesi görmeye başlamış.
And at the beginning of the 2000s, the presence of the immigrants and the people who are willing to immigrate to Europe are being assessed in more criminal perspective.
Özellikle Londra, Madrid saldırıları ve 11 Eylül saldırılarından sonra durum daha da netleşmiştir.
And the situation has become more and more exact after the terrorist attacks in London, Madrid, and September 9/11.
Amerika göçmenlere karşı Patriot yasası uygulamakta ve parmak izini çok önemsemektedir.
After 9/11 attacks, United States has enacted the patriotic law, and this enabled them to record all the fingerprints of the people who are willing to enter United States
Benzer
borders.
uygulamayı Avrupa'da yapmaktadır.
And Europe is tending towards a similar practice as well.
Türkiye bu bakımdan çok iyi bir sınav vermekte.
Turkey is rather better on this situation compared to US and Europe,
Ve açık kapı politikasını uygulamaktadır.
and adopts a open door policy to all potential immigrants.
Zorla geri göndermeyi asla yapmamaktadır.
We do not have a practice of forceful return to the people who are willing to immigrate.
Özellikle son günlerde Suriye'den gelen göçmenlerin sayısı 2 milyonu geçmiştir.
Until recently, the immigrants and the refugees from Syria, their number has already exceeded 2 million.
Sadece Kobani'den 2 günde 160 bin sığınmacı gelmiştir.
Only from Kobane in Syria, more than 260,000 people have fled out to our country.
Normalde Avrupa Birliği ülkelerinin tamamına yılda 130 bin kişi gelmektedir.
Considering that Europe has, in total, has 130,000 immigrants, this number is enormous for our country.
Toplam 4 milyardan fazla harcama yapılmıştır bugüne kadar.
And so far, for the refugees, we have been hosting more than $4 billion have been spent from our national budget.
Uluslararası yardım çağrımıza rağmen çok cüzi bir yardım gelebilmiştir.
And unfortunately, all of our pledges, all of our urges to the international community for financial assistance, a very modest amount has been earmarked for our country so far.
Türkiye sığınma ve göç konusunda tüm uluslararası, bölgesel ve milletlerarası yetkililer işbirliği halindedir.
And we are always in a close collaboration and cooperation in the issues related with asylum and immigration with the rest of the international community.
Budapeşte sürecinin başkanlığı devam etmekte Türkiye üzerinde.
And our presidency of the Budapest process is continuing.
Sonuç olarak Avrupa Birliği göçmen ve sığınma konusunda tam bir mutabakata varamamıştır.
And to conclude, we observe that EU and EU countries cannot agree on a single policy on such issues.
Çok sayıda belge var. Schengen Anlaşması ve daha sonra 12 Avrupa Birliği ülkesinin yaptığı Dublin Sözleşmesi.
And there are various legal documents, including Schengen and Dublin agreements,
Bonn protokolü,
Bond Protocol,
Amsterdam Antlaşması,
Amsterdam Treaty,
Tampere kararları,
Tampere decisions,
hasılı bu alanda çok sayıda belge karmaşık bir tablo oluşturmaktadır.
and this appears to complicate the issue further because of multitude
Bir an
documents.
önce bunun netleşmesi gerekmektedir.
And we believe that we need to be exact and concrete by simplifying all these various legal structures.
Çok teşekkür ederiz.
Thank you very much.
Grazie, continuo a raccomandare ai colleghi.
Thank you, and again I'd like to recommend you to keep to the time I indicated so that everybody can have time to take the floor. I'd like to floor Halil Dukovic.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished chair. I will try to, in short, some experiences which Montenegro has in the field of the asylum and in relation to application of the law on asylum, which has been applied from 2007. And what I would like to say is that there are some data on persons in care. For example, since we started to apply the law from 2007 and until 2010, we performed care for 28 persons. In 2012, that number increased to 1,464 persons, and in 2013 we had a record when we took care of 3,472 persons. Of course, taking care is performed in Montenegro by Directorate for the Care of Refugees, a body which is a part of the Ministry of Labor. Some of the facts which are very important for the asylum systems are primarily safety of borders, problem which was mentioned by all other speakers, and it demands international coordination and common strategy for preventing illegal migrations, and what is also important, sanctioning of the group who are working on illegal migrations and on smuggling people. And those groups are increasing at the moment. The second important fact is preventive action against vulnerable groups, which can be the subject of trafficking in human beings. And the third fact, which is very important, especially for applicant countries, is continuous training of all those services who are in charge of the problem of the asylum, including their technical assistance. Of course, problem of migration is very grave today due to wars and economical problems, and of course there will always be some new reasons for migrations, and we have a joint commitment to act jointly and to provide a good legal solution and to find solutions which will not harm refugees but not also countries of destination. I tried to respect time, so thank you.
Thank you. Speakers, I would like to say a few words about what is definitely one of the biggest challenges of our time. Right now, the largest humanitarian catastrophe in modern time takes place close to Europe. So far, 200,000 people have lost their lives in the Syrian civil war. Over 10,000 children have died in the war. Syria is right now the worst place in the world for children. Despite this, considering how big the conflict is and how many people that have had to leave their homes, rather few have managed to come to Europe. Most refugees are still close to the war in countries which have far worse possibilities to give them good opportunities than the European countries. Even though all the member states of the EU have signed international conventions stating that everyone has the right to seek asylum and that everyone who needs protection against prosecution should receive it, we have paradoxically criminalized the flight itself. We won't be able to prevent departures. People who flee, they do it because they don't have a choice.
There are no legal ways for asylum seekers to enter the European Union and seek asylum. Instead, they're forced to pay human traffickers lots of money and risk their lives in almost not seaworthy boats on the Mediterranean, with a 16 to 17% risk of losing their lives on the way over. This is a disgrace for our time. We cannot justify our non-actions by saying that we didn't know why they had to escape, or know that they had to risk their lives to reach a life of freedom and safety. We have seen the awful TV pictures from Syria. We know how many that drown each year in the Mediterranean. We know, and we are co-responsible for it. Fortunately, this is something that can be changed. It's a situation created by policy that can be changed by policy. We can create legal and safe entry for asylum seekers to the European Union. Humanitarian visas could be issued. Asylum seekers could be granted visas so that they could come to Europe to seek asylum here. We should not open refugee camps where asylum applications are processed in third countries, though. To outsource the asylum seeking process to a country far away can lead to terrible consequences. If asylum seekers aren't in our close surroundings, they are more easily reduced to figures and statistics. There is a risk that they will be treated more inhumane in that case. Instead, they should have the possibility to get a visa to come to the EU to apply for asylum. Other regular ways, for instance labor migration, also need to be more open. If we want to combat illegal migration and human traffickers or migrants, we need to open up for legal alternatives for those refugees who today do not have any other option. Thank you.
Grazie.
Many thanks. I'd now like to give the floor immediately to Minister Alfano for a reply, since he has institutional commitments, which means that he has to leave. Minister Alfano. Thank you, Chair. I listened with great interest to the talks that were given after mine, and I would like to thank the keynote speakers for the very comprehensive statements, and also I'd like to thank some of the discussants too. I think that there's a very clear confirmation of the complexity of the expectations with regard to the Union. Perhaps emphasizing things, we could say that today the European Union is the institution which has the greatest expectations there are. The expectations in regard of the Union are so large that really makes one shake. And the Union has to complete its union through facts and through the achievement of concrete operations which show that everything done so far has meant something. The other challenge of expansion, which is enlargement, which is something which has to be done in coordination with the missions and the goals of the Union, because I think that the European peoples need to see the European Union as a community of destinies, of peoples who have decided to be together. This community of destiny is a enormous mission, a huge mission, and the challenge of which hinges on immigration, as I was saying in my introduction, is very delicate for the Union. Many have referred to populists, to the various nationalists, to the real threat which underlies the need for good governance in the European Union, namely the challenge of populists who state that Europe is the problem. For those who believe that, conversely, Europe can provide the solution or important solutions, it is important to achieve these solutions, because only the achievement of these solutions can be an effective retort to those who claim the uselessness or the actual damage of the caused by the European Union. I think this is essential for the European Union and the destiny of Europe. Clearly, through regulations and practical actions, principles of solidarity and responsibility have to be implemented. I've heard representatives speaking of Dublin and the need to make some changes in that instrument. I think that it's very important today to say that the European Union should not be afraid to change its rules when these rules are no longer in line with the times. And this courage is something which the European Parliament has to have, and the very complex governance system of the European Union, because we have to be aware that one great risk is the complexity of the decision-making procedures in the European Union. When a decision has to be taken based on the kind of decision, you know that the involvement of governments on the one hand, member states that is, and on the other hand the European Parliament, and also then the Commission can lead to time frames for decision making which are completely different from the rapidity required in reacting to situations, and which is required in particular by people. So I'm saying this because 12 months after the Lampedusa tragedy, the biggest problem we found among the Italian population has been the fact that EU decisions take place out of step with the perception of emergency which citizens see. So I think that updating strategies, updating regulations, and if possible, the possibility for the European Union to react immediately are essential keys for the future of the European Union. Returning, and I will then conclude, to the premise of the meeting, I believe that it is necessary to strengthen all the pillars which we have talked of, because strengthening one and leaving another weak would cause an imbalance in the architecture of our response to the issue of immigration and asylum. So cooperation with other countries, the centralization of the asylum system in Europe, and monitoring of borders. These are things which have solidarity and responsibility as a framework, and therefore the respect of human rights. These pillars all have to stand together, and they have to be all strengthened and improved together. We can't have one of the levels moving at a higher speed than others. You can't have one of the pillars more solid than the others. They have to be at the same level, and in their process of growth they have to be absolutely homogeneous. This is essential for us, and we believe that the goal of this meeting, which has the value of making parliaments protagonists, is to generate a common sensation which can be conveyed to parliaments, who then have to guide governments and ratify the decisions of governments. So I thank you once again, and I hope that the discussion, which I won't be able to listen to till the end, will indicate further interesting developments with regard to asylum and immigration policy. Thank you, Minister Alfano, and I would like to give the floor to Anna Nems.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The migration policy in Europe is complex. Europe, which wants to have a competitive economy, to have a development, must find the balance between the openness to immigrants with the internal security and the growth in the economy. A balance is the key to success. Sometimes immigration is a big problem. Sometimes it's associated with smuggling and human trafficking. But we have to remember that we need high-quality workers, scientists, students. We want to be competitive. In the time of crisis, social atmosphere is very important. We talked about that in Greece a few months ago. People also are becoming more and more radical, sometimes with populism, speech of hate, xenophobia, racism. It's so important, effective using the law which we have. Flexible system of law instrument which contains different economic situation in each country in Europe. A global approach to migration and mobility must be mixed with the most important policies in Europe. In my conclusion, I want to say that success in migration policy means, of course, economic and social development in whole Europe. Grazie.
Molte grazie. La parola.
Many thanks. Panagiotta Yakubida has the floor.
Κυρία Προεδρεύουσα, κύριε Υπουργέ, κυρίες και κύριοι.
Minister, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, the migratory pressure on Greece is considerable. The number of arrivals of undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers is growing, and the management system of these flows, which already was under pressure, is undergoing even more pressure because of human resources and infrastructure. There is a gap of 60 million euros in Greece, which cannot be covered with the resources of the national budget because of the economic crisis. We need to have an expansion of European Union funds and a smoother procedure for use. It's not acceptable for Greece to shoulder the greatest burden of migration when migrants are aiming for Northern European countries. So there has to be a fairer sharing out of people looking for international protection who enter undocumented, and we need to realize that we're threatened by economic destabilization, but also the disruption of our social fabric. Independently of the situation, systems to deal with asylum seekers and border facilities are being built over in the last 2 years by the Greek authorities, and we continue to do that successfully. Migratory policy of the European Union has to be re-examined so that the system of management of asylum and migration can be sustainable and effective. Legal migration should be encouraged. Human trafficking must be severely punished. The external borders of Europe need to be monitored effectively, and Frontex has to be reinforced. The general European policy with regard to migration and asylum has to be common and fair in terms of burdens and obligations while respecting fundamental rights. The fact is that recently migratory flows are constantly growing, and this factor is something which is a reason for alarm. This is a situation which generates special pressure on our structures and also on the services which guard the maritime borders of Greece. The European Commission is aware of this. On the 22nd of July this year, Cecilia Malmström, the relevant commissioner, visited the Centre for First Reception and Identification of Foreigners on the island of Lesbos. It's a huge issue, and Greece cannot deal with it alone. I repeat, something which all member states of the European Union must consider to be a basic principle. is that the solution of this problem can only be founded on solidarity and a fair distribution of burdens. The borders of Greece are also borders of Europe. Thank you. Thanks to our colleague. Now I'd like to give the floor to Yanos Lamaris.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Of course, we all agree that the European Union must strive towards a true European common migration and asylum policy with a legal framework which will respect the fundamental rights of migrants and asylum seekers. However, the ability of a country to host asylum seekers is of paramount importance. The resources, the economic state, and the overall condition of the country shall always be taken into consideration. For example, Cyprus, a country under a strict loan agreement provision by the Troika, a country that is facing an unprecedented financial crisis. Is Cyprus today in a position to face the challenges which are posed by illegal migration and by asylum seeking? For that matter, can any small country with limited resources and under immense financial pressures deal effectively and quickly to instances such as the recent incident off the coast of Cyprus, where more than 300 refugees from Syria, including more than 50 children, were rescued by a Cypriot cruise ship? Of course, the question arises, what will Cyprus do with these people? Of the 300 plus such immigrants, only 6 wish to remain in Cyprus. The rest want to find their ways to other countries where they claim they have relatives and families. So what about the policy of reuniting such families, the European policy of reuniting such families? Can we effectively implement it and ensure that it will work? And why should all the burden of handling and caring for these people be placed on European Union frontline receiving countries? The interconnection of related policy areas, particularly enhanced integration of migration policies in the Union's external and development policies, may well be the answer to facing such challenges before us. As we commit to a safer European Union, cooperation with different EU agencies, as well as the enhancement of their role in the field, is crucial. And of course, equally important is the need to intensify cooperation with the countries of origin and transit. Thank you.
La parola a Liliana Kozlov.
Over to Liliana Kozlovic.
Chair, over the past year, the management of migration flows has become an increasingly serious challenge for EU policies, particularly as regards illegal migration, which is constantly rising and focused on the Mediterranean. Moreover, there is an increasing number of asylum seekers crossing the countries of the Western Balkans. Slovenia has been following the migration flows to the EU with care, particularly developments in the Mediterranean. We are indeed aware of how important it is to adopt a serious approach to the search for immediate and adequate solution and as well for cooperation among EU member states and for enhanced dialogue with the countries from which people come and the countries people came to. Slovenia supports and participates in all activities undertaken at EU level to tackle the present challenges. We support the work of the Task Force Mediterranean and the efforts made by the Italian presidency. We welcome the Mare Nostrum operation, to which Slovenia joined from the 15th of October 2013 to the 1st of January 2014 with its military ship Triglav. Slovenia supports the Khartoum process. At the same time, we should make every effort to combat organized crime and fully respect fundamental human rights and freedoms. And finally, we think that an active part in the above activities should indeed to be taken by the national parliaments of the member states. Thank you for your attention.
Molte grazie.
Thank you very much. Over to Deborah Schembri, Malta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have listened very attentively to whatever everybody has said, and I was particularly struck by what Mr. Visser said, that we have a European framework. It is true that we have a European framework, but we don't have a common migration and asylum policy. So we have a structure without a common vision. And that is very, very difficult for countries like my country, which in this whole situation have the short end of the stick. We have a European framework, but that framework puts countries like Malta at the mercy of other countries. We are not part of a common solution. Being part of the EU means that we have to respect the said European framework. However, that framework leaves countries like ours, countries that are at the borders of Europe, to treat the problem individually, on our own. If we are one European Union, why are countries on which migrants set foot seen as individual countries by Dublin II? Why isn't it seen as these people setting foot on Europe? Why isn't it being treated as a European issue each time a border country is faced with an influx of migrants? I also heard Minister Alfano say the EU should not be afraid to change its rules when they are not keeping up with the times. I say that Europe should not be afraid to change its rules when they are hindering rather than helping the process and protection of human rights. Human rights come first. We have to be strong because we might not be popular, we might not have popular support in our own countries, as it always happens with minority rights and rights of this sort. But we are the chairpersons of the fundamental human rights protections. That is why we're here for. And therefore, we need to step up. We need to be the ones to push our governments to do something about it, because this is our role. And we all have to keep fundamental human rights at the top of the agenda. We should be fighting on the same side. We shouldn't be trying to push migrants to other countries to see who, according to Dublin II, should take them. We should all be fighting to see what their human rights are and fight for them. And this is what I hope comes out of a conference, a meeting like this, an energy to actually go to our governments. I leave you with one thought. A neighbor of mine is in the armed forces, and in the Lampedusa tragedy, he helped pick up the bodies from the sea. And he had a breakdown, a depression, for months after that. And I asked him, why? What is it? He told me, every time I was picking somebody, I was imagining my son. If we have that image in our minds, I think we would run to our governments and help, ask for help. So please, treat it as something important and treat it as something yours and personal, and let's do something about it commonly, together. Fight for human rights, which is our mission. Thank you very much.
Now over to Franz Perhab.
Yeah. Austria has made a significant contribution to the international refugee protection. Austria acknowledges resettlement as one of the 3 sustainable solutions of international refugee protection. The Austrian government has agreed to receive 1,500 refugees from the region of Syria in cooperation with the United Nations. This means that Austria is taking the largest number of refugees directly from Syria after the great country of Germany. Importance of the participation of all EU countries is the absorption of refugees to an established formula based on objective criteria, taking into account the current loads. Austria has a project to save lives presented at EU level that people fleeing persecution and seeking protection for a legal and safe immigrant should enable in the EU. Thank you very much.
Grazie. L'ultimo
Thank you. The last speaker, Jason Azzopardi. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to start by stating my position. I don't think that migration should be seen as a problem to be solved. It is actually a challenge that has to be addressed, and we have to do this so as to ensure that we have adequate approaches, and we have to think about it in terms of social cohesion and the possibility for migrants to settle legally. A successful migration policy is instrumental in ensuring successful integration. We know that migrants and non-migrants in an area can be in a state of conflict, and there can be losers and winners in the process of integration involving migrants on the one hand and the native populations on the other. We know that there is a potential conflict that we're obviously very keenly aware of. Third point I would like to make is the importance of self-confidence. In other words, social and cultural integration of migrants in Europe cannot occur in the absence of self-confidence. We have to be socially and culturally self-confident as Europeans. The possibility of adequately managing the global challenge is something we must believe possible. Our cultural and social resources are sufficient, and so we must be self-confident. Fourth point, the Cotonou Agreement. Nobody has mentioned this agreement, which was signed in 2000 and has been in force since 2003. It is an agreement between the European Union and African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. We know that the fight against illegal migration is to be supported by adequate policies in support of sending countries. We have to invest resources to implement the Cotonou Agreement. A fifth and last point, joint responsibility. Equal sharing of responsibilities is essential. Unfortunately, if I may say so, our people at home tell us that other countries are totally oblivious to the difficulties that we have in Malta. The situation in Malta is harder than elsewhere. Why? Because our population density is the highest in Europe, 1,200 people per square kilometre, not 200, as is true of other countries. And when our reception centres are full, we cannot transfer people elsewhere in the hinterland because we're an island and therefore they have nowhere else to go. Frontex cannot replace adequately, and I express my doubts, cannot replace adequately Mare Nostrum. And therefore our union needs a system to ensure that there's a more balanced distribution of refugees to avoid building up pressure on individual countries. Finally, Dublin. Those who support the status quo should change their defensive attitude. The basic principle of Dublin 3 should be reviewed. The Dublin 3 regulation was approved at a time when the situation was very different. My country is an area where we have 250,000 square kilometers to monitor and survey. This is a disproportionate weight. There is the intransigence of the countries that favour the status quo, and that's why we find ourselves in this difficult situation. This is a topic that needs to be addressed because in the absence of political commitment on the part of member states to guarantee solidarity, we'll only have fine words but no concrete facts. Thank you very much. Another request for the floor. Gergely Goulias.
Dear President, dear colleagues, thanks for the floor and for the opportunity to have a short oral remarks. First of all, on behalf of the Hungarian delegation, I would like to thank the Italian presidency for the invitation and organization of the meeting of chairpersons of the committees on fundamental rights. The coherence of the migration policy with other goals of the EU has been ensured. The EU should look for a way to cover a broader group of migrants instead of only targeting at certain smaller groups through the sectoral approach of legislation. The policy on legal migration should be cancelled into the issues of external relations. In the field of asylum, we find it necessary to focus on consolidation and the implementation of adopted European legislation parallel to strengthen the practical cooperation among member states and with EU agencies. For example, the European Asylum Support Office. The external dimension of asylum need to be further developed in order to provide international protection in the proximity of crisis areas. In Hungarian view, at European level, the implementation of regional development and protection programs would be best served to improvement of the situation in the region concerned. We believe that the initiative for voluntary measures aiming to support member states whose systems are under high pressure and which could result in real burden sharing are very well worth considering. The global approach to migration and mobility, the so-called GAM, is an important guideline in the relation of the EU and third countries. The GAM offers many tools, such as mobility partnership, common agendas for migration and mobility, or regional dialogues. In our opinion, the most important tools are the regional migration dialogues. The colleague from Turkey mentioned the Budapest process. Hungary is especially active in the dialogues towards our eastern neighbors. Much attention has been paid to the migration-related tragic events in the Mediterranean. The successful tackle in increased migratory pressure, we are convinced that a balanced geographical approach is needed in the EU, not forgetting the migration routes on the land. It has to be highlighted that the reinforced action against illegal migration in the Mediterranean have resulted in an increased pressure on the migration routes via the Balkans. The Council conclusions on the implementation of the GAM of April 2014, based on the report of the Commission, have reaffirmed the GAM as the comprehensive framework of the external dimension of the EU's migration and asylum policy, and underline the need for its efficient implementation. Thanks for your attention.
Molte grazie, abbiamo così concluso gli...
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the various questions, and I'd like to ask whether François Crépeau would like to respond and answer the questions that have been addressed to him. He's still with us?
Yes, I'm still with you. Thank you very much. I've much appreciated all the interventions that were made. I'll make 3 quick points and a conclusion. First of all, refugee resettlement. Europe cannot leave millions of refugees at its doors and not expect that they will move on. I think that Europe, Canada, USA, Australia can absorb easily 1 million refugees in the next, let's say, 4 years, if you distribute that among all 4 regions. If we announce that collectively, and for that we need political leadership, if we announce that and we create legal channels to move out of those refugee camps into other countries for durable solutions, we already reduce the pressure on the borders of Europe, because people will hope that there will be a legal solution for them, and then you undercut the call of the smuggling rings. So this is something we should work on, and Europe could play a very important leadership role in calling for a great refugee resettlement plan, like we did for the Indo-Chinese at the end of the 70s, early 80s. Second point, we must move conceptually from a zero tolerance policy towards migration, irregular migration, to a harm reduction policy. Like we did in the prohibition era in the United States, when prohibiting the trade and production of alcohol was a major and costly failure, when managing, governing, taxing alcohol and letting it move across borders, etc., was a much better solution, which was agreed upon after a number of years. We are slowly coming to the same conclusion on the war on drugs. 30, 40 years of war on drugs, and the drug cartels are still as powerful because we have contributed to entrenching them. Same for smuggling and trafficking. Mobility is the only answer. It has to be a governed mobility, a regulated mobility. It's not free for all. Borders are not going to disappear. It has to be governed, regulated, but it has to be mobile. This is the only answer to make sure that we disentrench the smuggling rings. It will take, erecting borders only works so far. See what happened at the southern border of the United States, which has been extremely well provided with resources, fences, border guards, etc. Yet, over the last summer, 60,000 youth from Central America arrived. We will not be able to seal borders, however, the amount of resources we pour at it. It's much better to not open the border free for all, but to govern the migration flow through the border by registering people, etc., and not trying to prevent them, which only hands them into the hands of the mafias. My third point is solidarity. I believe, and it's been said before, that the Dublin approach is a profoundly flawed approach. To say that it's the next state that is responsible for dealing with the issue is not a form of solidarity, even though there has been solidarity efforts in terms of funds and in terms, for example, the Frontex operations, which are very important and are well designed and have been better designed over the years. It's not sufficient. Solidarity means that we cannot leave hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants on the territories of the frontline states, which not only are tasked with guarding the border, but they're tasked with keeping the migrants very often when they are themselves in a state of crisis. So it's not sustainable either. Solidarity will be implemented mostly through, again, mobility through the European Union, so that people may be, as it was mentioned, distributed among the European Union where they can better find jobs, where they can better contribute to the wealth of everyone, and where they can find their family members, etc. On all of these 3 points, I think what is lacking, and this is a structural issue that we all face, what we're lacking is political leadership. Why is that? We're lacking political leadership because there's no electorate out there to gain if we protect the rights of migrants, because they don't vote. And so it is difficult for politicians to find an incentive to protect the rights of migrants and to have pro-migration policies when there's so much incentive against that. This is a structural issue. In our electoral democracies, the electoral incentive is through representation, and migrants are not represented. We know that women and detainees and gays and lesbians won battles through their representation and through going to court and through access to justice, but through representation, because politicians were compelled to include their issues because they wanted their votes. This is not going to happen for migrants. Therefore, we need to find other ways. Access to justice is one, but we also need political leadership. We need leadership to tell the real story, to tell, for example, our electorates that borders cannot be sealed, that people will move through the borders, and that we will have to accommodate that. And the best way to accommodate that is through well-governed mobility. It's difficult. It's very difficult. But it has to be done because more harm will come to the migrants, but also to our societies when we, willingly or not, espouse the nationalist populist discourse or comfort the people who believe that we can stop irregular migration at any cost. It's not possible. We need a firm language based on human rights that tell that nationalist populist fantasies are just that, fantasies, and that we have to deal with the real issues. Thank you very much.
Molte grazie, do adesso...
Many thanks, and I'd like to give the floor to Roy Visser for his reply.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your contributions and reactions. From my side, very short. I underline the fact, and I am very happy with the fact that the word integration was mentioned. That is the part of the debate that sometimes is missing far too much, and we should realize, and certainly you will in the context of the Human Rights Commissions where you are present in your own countries, very much aware, once you take the responsibility to offer someone protection, that means integration. You can't say yes to someone and then deny integrating in a society. Very important point. Second, solidarity, fair share, burden sharing, many, many labels. At one hand, that is a very political debate, we all know, and that comes with Deborah Schwemli, who said that we are lacking a European migration policy. I'm not entirely agreeing on that, because also a legal framework has a concept, has certain starting points and has certain goals, and that is what in general we also consider to be policy. But at the other hand, and that is my point on the framework, I very much agree that there should be a much more elaborated political discussion about the goals. Elizabeth Corlett, in her contribution, referred to it as well. Europe is not speaking enough about where we want really to go, and that's policy. But that's your job. We can contribute, we can feed in the process, we can give you examples, and I'm more than willing to, but in the end, that is the job of the politics and politicians, and very good if it would be stimulated by meetings like this. That is certainly so. 2 extra words on solidarity. Francois Crepeau just spoke about tell the real story. If you speak about burden sharing, tell the real story. It's not only about borders. It is not only about the Mediterranean. As I said before, I'm happy that we are now also mentioning the east border, which is also a real border. But it is also about people who have been, for other reasons, for legal avenues, which we all very much stress here, in Europe, large numbers, students, visa, whatever, and then apply for asylum because they're Syrians and their family back home says simply don't come back. And they're right. I mean, they're understandably right. So it's not only about borders. Also, that is part of the real story. Last but not least, yes, you can change, as I said in my introduction, European framework, European legal framework. Do so. Europe is a living animal, and living organism should change, should adapt, should update very much. Maybe Dublin one day should be changed. At the same hand, also look very carefully on what it is. it's not that one-liner that is very often referred to. Dublin is many things. And one of the things, and then I stop, Madam President, one of the things which is good in Dublin, mind you, is that there is a very advanced system of tracing the family relations of people who knock on the door, who ask for asylum. That is exactly what we're now discussing with the Italian government, that the large numbers that arrive, specifically in Sicily, where you have the largest concentrations, we look into using Dublin, not denying Dublin, but using Dublin in the way that we will have an accelerated procedure for people who have family in, for example, Sweden, and that they should not wait too long, but can accelerated procedure go to Sweden, Germany, or other places. So yes, maybe it should be changed in the future, that's a political debate, but also use what is there. Thank you very much.
Grazie, do la parola adesso.
Thank you. Elizabeth Colt has the floor.
Thank you, and I think thank you for this discussion, which has been rich and I think highlighted the deep complexities of this issue. There are hard choices facing each and every European member state, and I think that's something that philosophically many governments have yet to conclude, that it's not just about the compromises of that state over there and that state over there, but not me, I'm doing everything right. Every single country is going to have to take a very real look at where it makes compromises in order to find a European solution. I just want to make a couple of points on some of the things that were raised. I'm really pleased that Rob Visser mentioned legal entry and overstay, and it's not just about borders, but there are other ways in which people can fall into irregularity. And sometimes I think the rhetoric of borders and closed and open borders and the rhetoric of Fortress Europe can obscure inaction that occurs in other areas. I would also be wary of overly simplistic solutions. The idea that opening borders would destroy a smuggling business model doesn't make sense. The evidence doesn't tell us that. The evidence says a lot of different things would have to be done simultaneously, and a lot of very, very, very difficult things. You know, European Union citizens, whether in their own country or living elsewhere, find themselves in situations of labor exploitation. So migrants, even if they had legal entry, might still fall prey to the hands of those who would exploit them, whether at the hands of traffickers or elsewhere. We have to look at the high levels of vested interest in third countries and the extraordinary revenues that the smuggling and trafficking business model generates. We're talking billions of dollars every year. The idea that opening up some legal channels will destroy this business model, I think, completely underestimates the scale of the challenge and also the complexity. We have to look at the way our labour markets function. We have to look at the way we regulate those labour markets. We also have to look at how much we're willing to pay for our cost of living and how much we're happy for it to be subsidised by those people working in the greyer areas of the labour market. And finally, I do think legal channels do play a role. I was intrigued by Mr. Crepeau's suggestion that 1 million is a number of resettled refugees that the EU can absorb. I think it's an admirable goal, and I would certainly think that member states should be working towards a much greater number. One of my questions, though, is the complexities of this, I think, require far more analysis, which is, who do you take? Do you take 1 million from Syria, or do you take 1 million from the Dadaab camp in Kenya, where people have grown up in displaced situations with a very hopeless future? Who do you take? Who is the most needy and the most vulnerable? Who has the most potential to survive? And I think Rob is exactly right talking about integration. If you bring someone who has very, very few skills and capacity to thrive in the European society, are you necessarily doing them a favour? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about tradable jobs and this idea that we think that the demographics and the economics of the European Union can't broaden out into other regions. How can we think about neighbourhood policy in the future? How can we think of sectors of our own industries that might better be done overseas and creating jobs in countries of transit and countries of origin that create a more even sense of our labour markets in the future, rather than thinking about this being a static labour market within the European Union that can't be transferred outwards? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Molte grazie, ringraziamo.
Many thanks. We wish to thank all colleagues for their participation, all the keynote speakers and all our colleagues who've taken part in the discussion. We've completed the session. We're a bit late on the time scheduled. And now, if you wish, there's a coffee break in the corridor. I would like to ask you to be back in a quarter of an hour so that we can begin the fourth session of our work. Thank you.